I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, long enough to know the rules of the road by heart. Deadlines, deliveries, and long stretches of highway, all familiar routines. The road became my home, my one true constant in life. But that night on Ridgeway Road, I still can't explain what happened. It started at a rundown gas station, miles from any major city. I had been pushing hard to meet my deadline, running later than usual, and the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon. The place was quiet, too quiet if I'm being honest. The air had that heavy stillness you only feel in the middle of nowhere, where the silence almost buzzes in your ears. I parked my truck and headed inside the little diner attached to the gas station. It was the kind of place that felt stuck in time, with faded linoleum floors and a few old men sipping coffee like they hadn't moved in years. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped in, and a woman behind the counter gave me a nod. "Coffee and a sandwich," I said, trying to shake off the exhaustion creeping into my bones. I had a long drive ahead of me, and I wasn't about to let a little fatigue slow me down. As I waited for my food, I noticed a couple of the regulars in the corner glance over at me. One of them, an old-timer with a worn trucker hat, leaned toward his buddy and whispered something. They both looked at me again. "What's the rush?" the woman asked as she slid the coffee across the counter. "Got a deadline to meet. Gonna take Ridgeway Road through the forest, save me a few hours." The clatter of a fork hitting a plate caught my attention. One of the old men, his face lined with age and worry, stood up from his seat. "You don't want to be taking Ridgeway this time of night," he said, his voice low but insistent. I frowned. "Why's that?" The woman behind the counter shot him a warning look, but he kept talking, his hands shaking a little as he shoved them into his pockets. "Travelers don't come back from that road after dark," he said. "Strange things happen on Ridgeway. Folks around here know better." "Look, I don't have time for ghost stories," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual, though his words had stirred something uneasy in me. "I've been on worse roads." He shook his head. "This ain't just another road. Once you're on it, you don't come off. And if you do, you ain't the same." I let out a small chuckle, more for my own benefit than anything. "I'll be fine. Thanks for the heads up." I grabbed my sandwich and coffee, paid the bill, and made my way out of the diner. But as I left, I could feel their eyes on me, watching like they knew something I didn't. Something they weren't willing to fully explain. The last bit of daylight was fading as I climbed back into the truck. The sky was bruised with deep purples and grays, the kind of night that settles fast. I fired up the engine and pulled out of the gas station, the quiet chatter of the CB radio crackling to life as I merged back onto the highway. I told myself the old man's warning was nothing more than small-town superstition, a story to keep travelers off their roads. But as I turned onto Ridgeway Road, the sense of isolation deepened. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches thick and gnarled like skeletal arms stretching out into the night. Ridgeway Road was narrow, with just enough space for my truck to pass comfortably. The asphalt was worn, cracked in places, as if it hadn't been maintained in years. On either side, the dense forest loomed, towering pines and oaks, their shadows creating an oppressive tunnel that my headlights barely managed to pierce. I had been driving for maybe an hour when the first strange thing happened. The CB radio crackled again, which wasn't unusual. Out here, you sometimes picked up interference from other drivers or local stations. But this time, the voices were frantic. "Turn back now," a voice crackled through the static, barely audible. I frowned and adjusted the dial. "Repeat that, driver?" There was a long pause, just static hissing through the radio. Then another voice cut in, this one more desperate but clear enough to make out. "You need to get off this road. It doesn't end. You need to turn around." I squinted at the radio, my pulse quickening. It didn't sound like a prank. The fear in the driver's voice was real. I tried responding again, but the radio only hissed in response. The road ahead stretched on, dark and endless. I shook my head, trying to push the unease aside. Maybe it was interference. Maybe some local drivers like to mess with truckers on unfamiliar roads. I kept my focus on the asphalt, the dim glow of my headlights the only thing keeping the oppressive forest at bay. Then the truck shuddered. The engine sputtered for a second, then smoothed out again, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. I slowed down, pulling to the side of the road. The gravel crunched under my tires as I eased the truck to a stop. I killed the engine and stepped out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I grabbed a flashlight from the cab and did a quick check of the engine. Everything seemed fine. No leaks, no smoke, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I stood there, the unease I'd felt at the gas station returned, stronger this time. The trees were so thick it felt like they were watching me, listening. I shook it off and climbed back into the truck. The road stretched on ahead, but something about it felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. I started the engine again, the low rumble reassuring me as I pulled back onto the road. I drove for what felt like hours, but the forest never seemed to change. The same stretch of road, the same towering trees, all blending into one another like a loop I couldn't break. The CB radio stayed quiet save for the occasional static that reminded me how alone I was out here. Then I saw the first rest stop. It appeared out of nowhere, a small clearing on the side of the road with a weathered wooden sign that read, "Rest Stop 1 mile." I almost missed it, the sign barely illuminated by my headlights. I didn't need to stop, but something about it drew my attention. I kept driving, but after what seemed like another hour, another rest stop appeared. This one looked identical to the first. Same sign, same picnic tables, same lonely flickering light in the distance. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I driven in a circle? Had I missed a turn? I checked my GPS, but it wasn't working. No signal, no coordinates. Just a blank screen staring back at me. I drove on, hoping the road would eventually lead me somewhere, anywhere that wasn't surrounded by endless trees. But the rest stops kept coming. Every hour or so, another one would appear, identical to the last, as if the road itself was toying with me. Finally, exhaustion won out. I couldn't drive forever. I needed to stop, even if just for a few minutes. I pulled into one of the rest stops, the gravel crunching under the tires as I parked the truck. The place was deserted, just like all the others. The air felt colder here, the light from the lamppost flickering weakly, as if it might go out at any moment. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the picnic tables, my breath visible in the cold night air. The place felt wrong, frozen in time. I glanced at one of the tables, where a sandwich sat half-eaten, the bread stale and hard. A newspaper was spread out on the bench, its pages yellowed with age. The date on the newspaper was from the 1990s. I backed away, my pulse quickening. I had to get out of here. This wasn't right. None of it was right. I climbed back into the truck and started the engine, pulling out of the rest stop as fast as I could. But the road didn't change. It stretched on and on. The same endless stretch of highway. The same trees. The same suffocating darkness. And then I saw the headlights. At first, they were just a distant glow on the horizon, barely visible through the thick veil of darkness. My heart leapt at the sight. Another vehicle, finally. Maybe another trucker, someone else out here on this godforsaken road. But as the headlights drew closer, something felt off. The car was moving too fast, its headlights bouncing erratically, as if the driver had no control. I gripped the wheel tighter, slowing down as the car approached. But then, just as it was about to pass me, the headlights vanished. Gone. I slammed on the brakes, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the car behind me, but there was nothing. No taillights, no sound, just empty road. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been a reflection, or a trick of the light. But as I started driving again, the headlights reappeared. This time they were closer. They flickered in and out, growing brighter with each second, until once again, They vanished, just before reaching me. I cursed under my breath, my hands shaking on the wheel. What the hell was going on? The headlights kept coming, always appearing in the distance, always vanishing before they reached me. It was as if the road itself was toying with me, feeding off my fear, trapping me in an endless loop of flickering lights and disappearing cars. I wasn't sure how much longer I could take it. After hours of this eerie back and forth with the vanishing headlights, I decided to stop again. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, and I couldn't drive much longer without risking falling asleep behind the wheel. I pulled into yet another identical rest stop, this one even more desolate than the others. I locked the truck and climbed into the back to try and get some rest. I needed sleep, even if my mind was racing with questions. I lay down in the narrow bed behind the seats, pulling my jacket over me for warmth. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard something. A voice, faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But it grew louder, more insistent, like someone was calling out to me. I sat up, my heart pounding. I peered out the window, squinting into the darkness. There was someone standing at the edge of the rest stop. They hadn't been there before. The place had been completely empty when I arrived, and there were no cars, no signs of life. But now, in the dim light from the lamppost, I could see a man standing just beyond the picnic tables, their back turned to me. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the man was still there, unmoving. I had to know who it was. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the truck, my breath catching in my throat as I approached the man. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "You need help?" No response. I walked closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But as I stepped around the picnic tables, the man vanished. 1 second they were there, the next gone. Just like the headlights. I spun around, my heart racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the exhaustion was getting to me, but as I headed back to the truck, a cold chill ran down my spine. When I climbed into the cab, I froze. There, in the bed of the truck, lying just behind the seats, was the man. They were curled up, their face turned away, motionless. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, nearly falling out of the truck. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, trying to process what I was seeing. But when I looked again, the bed was empty. I climbed in, shut the door, and locked it. My hands were trembling, my heart racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I started the engine and pulled out of the rest stop, the road stretching out ahead of me once again. But no matter how far I drove, the same stretch of highway greeted me. The same rest stops, the same endless forest. The road had me trapped, and I didn't know how to escape. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal as I sped through the dark, winding road. It didn't matter how fast I went. The forest loomed on either side, thick and endless, and the road itself seemed to stretch on forever. I was no stranger to long hauls and lonely stretches of highway, but this was different. There was no sense of progress, no feeling of moving forward, just the same trees, the same rest stops, the same oppressive silence. And the man. I couldn't shake the image of him, lying in the bed of the truck, like he had always been there, waiting for me to notice. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him again. But each time, there was nothing, just the empty bed, the rumbling hum of the engine, and the vast, lonely night stretching out behind me. The road had become a trap. No matter how far I drove, no matter how many miles the odometer clocked, the landscape never changed. There were no towns, no signs of civilization, just the endless stretch of Ridgeway Road, winding through the heart of the forest like a snake coiling around me. I tried the CB radio again, hoping for some kind of contact. Anything to remind me I wasn't completely alone out here. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Blue on Ridgeway. Anyone copy?" My voice sounded strained, even to my own ears. There was a long pause, and then the static broke through, crackling with faint voices. "Turn back." The words cut through the static like a whisper, barely audible. My hands tightened on the wheel. "Who is this?" I asked, but there was no response. Just the hiss of dead air and the low rumble of the road beneath my tires. I kept driving, but with every mile the sense of dread grew heavier. It felt like I was driving deeper into something I couldn't explain, a place that shouldn't exist. The headlights continued their maddening routine, appearing in the distance, growing closer, then vanishing just before passing me. The road seemed to be alive, playing tricks on me, wearing me down, testing how much longer I could go before I broke. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. My eyes were heavy, my muscles aching from the tension of driving for so long. My mind was playing tricks on me, blurring the lines between reality and exhaustion. I needed to stop, but I couldn't face another one of those cursed rest stops. So I pulled over on the side of the road instead, into a small clearing just beyond the tree line. I killed the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, my heart still racing from the constant adrenaline that had kept me going all night. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs, hoping the cold air would wake me up. But as soon as I stepped outside, I felt it again, that creeping sensation that something wasn't right. The air was thick with tension, and the forest seemed different. I took a few steps away from the truck, scanning the tree line. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first I thought they might belong to an animal, but the shapes were strange, too large and too human to belong to any creature I knew. They circled the clearing, crisscrossing in random patterns, like someone had been pacing back and forth just beyond the reach of my headlights. The sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something darted between the trees, just a flicker of shadow, too fast for me to make out. I froze, squinting into the darkness. The forest had always felt dense and alive, but now it felt claustrophobic, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I shook my head, trying to shake off the paranoia. I was just tired, that was all. I needed rest. The shadows in the woods were just that, shadows. I climbed back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. I threw myself onto the narrow bed in the cab and pulled my jacket over me. I wasn't sure how I'd get any sleep with my mind racing, but I knew I needed to rest before continuing. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the truck, every rustle of the wind outside kept me on edge. My mind drifted back to the strange footprints and the shadows in the woods. And then I heard it. A soft scratching sound, faint at first, barely noticeable. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the right side door, like someone was trying to open it. The handle jiggled, then stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. I forced myself to move, inching toward the driver's seat. I peeked out the window, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the empty clearing and the shadows in the woods. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the truck, and pulled back onto the road. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man again. But the bed was empty. The hours passed slowly, each mile blending into the next. The road still didn't change. No towns, no intersections, no signs of life. Just the same unending stretch of highway, the same forest pressing in on all sides. Then as I rounded a curve, I saw him. The man from the rest stop. He was standing in the middle of the road, his figure barely illuminated by the truck's headlights. My heart leapt into my throat as I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just feet from where he stood. I blinked, my pulse pounding in my ears. He was gone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But there was no sign of him, just the empty road and the shadows cast by the trees. I took a deep breath and kept driving, my mind racing. The man wasn't real. He couldn't be. But I had seen him, hadn't I? Or had the road finally worn me down, broken my sense of reality? The headlights appeared again, flickering in the distance, growing closer, then vanishing into the darkness. I didn't care anymore. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The road was messing with me, playing with my head. But then, as the headlights vanished, I saw him again. The man, standing on the side of the road, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. I didn't slow down this time. I couldn't. I had to keep moving, had to find an end to this cursed road. But no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I went, the road just kept going. I don't know how long I'd been driving, hours, but the road finally began to change. The trees thinned out, the oppressive darkness lifted slightly, and in the distance, I saw something I hadn't seen in what felt like forever. An intersection, a way out. Relief flooded through me, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. Maybe the road was letting me go. I accelerated, the truck barreling toward the intersection. But just as I reached it, the CB radio crackled to life again. "You can't leave," a voice whispered through the static. I ignored it, my hands gripping the wheel tighter. The intersection was just ahead. I could see the road signs, the break in the trees, the open sky beyond. "You don't belong here," the voice said, more urgent now. I pressed down on the gas, my heart pounding. I wasn't going to let this road win. I wasn't going to let it trap me. But as I reached the intersection, the road behind me seemed to shift. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was again. The man, standing in the middle of the road watching me, his eyes locked on mine. I blinked, and he was gone. But this time, I didn't care. I tore through the intersection, leaving Ridgeway Road in the dust behind me. My hands were still shaking, knuckles white against the steering wheel, and my heart pounded in my chest like a drum that wouldn't slow down. I was free. The relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by exhaustion. My body felt like it had been dragged through hell, and my eyes were heavy, burning with the need for rest. The road ahead was different now, familiar, normal. There were other cars, the hum of civilization finally returning, as the trees thinned and the wide open highway stretched before me. About 30 miles out, I spotted a sign for a rest stop, one I hadn't seen before, and the sight of it brought a wave of gratitude I hadn't felt in hours. My stomach growled, and my whole body ached for a break. I pulled into the lot, parked the truck, and made my way into the rest stop. The place was quiet, but not in the eerie, suffocating way of Ridgeway's rest stops. This was the good kind of quiet, the kind where people were just eating, taking a break, and minding their own business. I grabbed some food, sat at a small booth, and let out a long breath. The warm, familiar smells of coffee and fries brought me back to reality. I dug into the burger and fries, grateful for the normalcy of it all. After finishing, I leaned back, finally feeling the tension in my muscles start to loosen. That's when I overheard them, a couple of men sitting a few tables over, deep in conversation. I hadn't been paying attention at first, but a word caught my ear. "Ridgeway." I froze, my body going stiff. One of the men, a grizzled-looking guy in a flannel jacket, was shaking his head. "Damn road's still closed off," he muttered. "Best that way if you ask me." His friend, a younger man, nodded. "Heard they shut it down years ago. Weird stuff happened on that road, didn't it?" "Yeah," the older man said. "Weird doesn't even cover it. Folks went missing. Trucks broke down. There's a reason they don't let anyone on it anymore. No one's been able to explain the stuff that happened out there. It's better off closed." My blood ran cold. I slowly set my cup down, staring at them as the reality of what I just heard settled in. Closed? Ridgeway Road was supposed to be closed? I had just spent hours driving that very road. How had I even gotten on it? I felt my heart hammering in my chest again, a deep sense of unease replacing the momentary relief I'd felt. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked over to their table. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're talking about Ridgeway Road?" The older man glanced up at me, squinting slightly. "Yeah, what about it?" I just came from that road. Drove the whole thing tonight." There was a beat of silence, and then both men laughed. Short, sharp chuckles like I'd just told the world's most unbelievable joke. The older man wiped his mouth with a napkin, shaking his head. "Nah, you didn't," he said, still grinning. "Ridgeway's been closed for a decade, pal. No one gets on that road. You must have taken a different route." "I'm serious," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I took Ridgeway. It was just miles and miles of forest, but there were rest stops and headlights that kept disappearing, and this guy, I saw him over and over again." Their smiles faded as they realized I wasn't joking. The younger man looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "Look, man, no one's been on that road in years. It's been blocked off. There's no way you were driving Ridgeway." "I'm telling you, I was on that road," I insisted, the desperation creeping into my voice. It felt like it was never going to end. I barely made it out of there. The older man leaned back in his seat, eyeing me warily. "That road's cursed, son. You're lucky to be standing here if you were really out there." I didn't know what to say. The words hung in the air, heavier than before. I felt the room shift slightly, like the weight of my experience was pressing down on all of us. I wasn't sure if they believed me, but I could tell by their silence that they didn't think I was lying anymore. I muttered a quick thanks and turned back to my table, trying to steady my breathing. I stared at my empty plate, my mind racing. Ridgeway Road had been closed for years. How had I driven it? How had I even gotten onto the road? And more importantly, how had I managed to escape? The thought chilled me to my core. The road wasn't just some forgotten highway. It was something else, something that should never have been accessible in the first place. Yet I had wandered onto it, driven its endless miles, encountered things that shouldn't exist. But I had gotten out. I had survived. I pushed my plate aside, no longer hungry. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief, like I had escaped from something far worse than I could have ever understood. The people at the rest stop went about their business, unaware of the nightmare I'd just lived through. I stood up, my body still buzzing with leftover adrenaline, and headed out of the rest stop, eager to get some sleep and put as much distance between me and Ridgeway as possible. As I walked back to my truck, the dark forest in the distance looked different, less menacing, more ordinary. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and lay down in the bed. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to being trapped on that road forever. Somehow, I had been one of the lucky ones. I woke up after a few hours with the sun peeking through the trees, warm and bright. I hadn't slept well. Images of Ridgeway Road haunted my dreams, the flickering headlights, the eerie rest stops, the man who kept appearing and vanishing. But I was out. I was safe. I started up the truck and pulled onto the highway, the world feeling more real, more grounded with each passing mile. Ridgeway was behind me, but something about that experience would stay with me forever. The road wasn't just closed, it was cursed, like the locals had said. It wasn't meant to be traveled, and I had somehow stumbled onto it by mistake. The farther I drove, the more normal everything became. But every now and then, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I never saw him again, but I know I wasn't imagining it. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled.